The cold was a living thing in the Ice Fang Citadel. It was a predator that lived in the stone, crept up through the soles of her worn boots, and laid its teeth against the back of her neck. Ilara had been born to this cold, raised in it. She was a servant, an omega, a ghost who polished silver that would never reflect her own face and scrubbed floors that were never clean enough. Worthless. The word was a brand on her soul, pressed there by years of dismissive glances and sharp-tongued commands. Her hands were perpetually raw, cracked and bleeding from the harsh lye soap and the icy water in the scullery buckets. She would plunge them into the water and hold them there, just for a moment, letting the shock of it travel up her arms. Sometimes the pain was the only thing that made her feel real. It was a sharp, clear note in the dull, gray song of her existence. Most of the pack ignored her. She was furniture, a moving shadow that brought food and took away empty plates. But Luna Valeriana, the Alpha King's cousin and the acting mistress of the Citadel, never ignored her. Valeriana's eyes, the color of a winter sky before a storm, found Ilara in every crowded room. Her voice, silken but sharp as a shard of ice, sliced through the air to find its target. "Girl, your hands are filthy. Do not let them touch the serving platters. Look at her, shoulders slumped like a beggar. Have you no pride? Worthless." That was her favorite. Valeriana would spit the word as if it were poison in her mouth, and Ilara would bow her head, the heat of shame a fleeting warmth on her cheeks, and murmur, "Yes, Luna." Because it was true, wasn't it? She had nothing. No family, no rank, no gift. She was just Ilara, a stray pup taken in out of pity, allowed to live in the shadow of the great Alpha King, a king no one had seen in years. The stories said he was a monster, a creature of ice and rage, his heart frozen by an ancient curse. They said he prowled the forbidden west wing of the citadel, his touch a death sentence, his eyes glowing with cold fury. The servants whispered that the chill in the castle wasn't natural. It was him. It was his dying soul bleeding out into the stones. Ilara didn't know if she believed the stories, but she felt the cold. It was a deep, gnawing cold that no fire could ever truly banish. It was the cold of profound loneliness. She recognized it because she felt it in her own bones. One evening, while clearing the plates from the high table after a formal dinner, she saw a piece of bread left on a golden plate. It was untouched. Her stomach clenched with a familiar, aching hunger. She hadn't eaten all day, a punishment for being too slow to bring Valeriana her morning tea. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it, her eyes darting around the empty hall. A small sound, a whimper, came from beneath the table. She knelt, her knees protesting on the cold stone. Huddled in the shadows was the kennel master's youngest pup, a runt with a lame leg that the others always pushed away from the food. His ribs showed, and his dark eyes were wide with a hunger that mirrored her own. Without a second thought, Ilara broke the bread in half. She placed one piece on the floor for the pup, who devoured it in frantic, grateful snaps. The other half she tucked into the pocket of her apron. She would eat it later, in her cold little room in the servants' quarters. It would taste better, knowing she had shared it. It was a small rebellion, a flicker of warmth in the suffocating cold, a quiet refusal to become as hard and merciless as the world she lived in. Her small act of kindness did not go unnoticed. From the shadows of the gallery above, Luna Valeriana watched, her lips thinning into a cruel line, a servant feeding a stray. It was an untidiness she would not tolerate. The next morning, the punishment came. "The West Wing has been neglected for too long," Valeriana announced, her voice echoing in the cavernous kitchen. The other servants busied themselves, suddenly fascinated by the potatoes they were peeling. No one met Ilara's eyes. "The dust must be inches thick. You will clean it. All of it." A collective gasp rippled through the staff. The West Wing. The King's Wing. No one went there. It was forbidden. Suicidal. Alara's blood ran cold, a fear that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Luna, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I am not permitted. Valeriana smiled, a slow, predatory curving of her lips. You are permitted by me. Take a bucket and a cloth. Start with the royal study. I want the floors to gleam. She leaned in, her scent of winter roses and cruelty filling Ilara's senses. Perhaps the beast will find you to his liking. It would be a more useful end for you than starving in the kennels. Her fate was sealed. With trembling hands, Ilara gathered a wooden bucket, a pail of icy water, and a few thin rags. Every step she took toward the West Wing felt like a step toward her own grave. The corridor grew colder, the tapestries on the walls stiff with frost. The air grew thin and sharp, burning her lungs. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket that smothered all sound. This was not just a place, it was a tomb. She pushed open the heavy oak doors to the royal study. The sight stole the breath from her lungs. It was a room encased in ice. A thick layer of frost covered everything. The towering bookshelves, the grand desk, the velvet curtains. Intricate ferns of ice crawled across the window panes, blocking out the gray light. A massive fireplace stood against one wall, a fire roaring within it, but its heat was swallowed by the oppressive cold. It gave off light, but no warmth. And in the center of the room, in a high-backed chair, sat a man, the Alpha King, Kalen. He was nothing like the monster from the stories. He was a man, broad-shouldered and powerfully built, dressed in dark furs. His hair was the color of midnight, streaked with silver like moonlight on a frozen lake. His face was harsh, carved from granite and sorrow, but it was a face of breathtaking, brutal beauty. His skin had a pale, bluish tint, and a fine layer of frost seemed to cling to his clothes, his hair, the very air around him. He didn't move. His eyes were closed, his long, dark lashes stark against his pale skin. His hands rested on the arms of the chair, his knuckles white. He looked like a statue, a king frozen onto his throne. Was he dead? Ilara took a hesitant step into the room, her worn boot crunching on a thin layer of ice that coated the floor. His eyes snapped open. They were not the eyes of a man. They were the color of a winter sky, pale and utterly colorless, and they seemed to glow with a faint internal light. They fixed on her, and the cold in the room intensified, pressing in on her, stealing the air from her lungs. This was a power unlike anything she had ever felt. It was ancient, vast, and dying. Fear, sharp and absolute, seized her. She dropped the bucket. It clattered against the icy floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the crushing silence. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the killing blow, waiting for the monster to uncoil and strike. "You are not supposed to be here," he said. His voice was not a roar, but a deep, quiet rumble like the shifting of a glacier. It was rough, as if from disuse, and held a profound weariness. Ilara could not speak. She could only tremble, her gaze fixed on the floor. He tried to stand, a pained grunt escaping his lips. He pushed himself up, leaning heavily on the arm of the chair. He swayed, a tremor running through his massive frame. He was not just cold, he was in agony. She could see it in the taut line of his jaw, the faint sheen of frozen sweat on his brow. The curse wasn't just a part of him, it was actively consuming him. He took a step toward her, then another. He stumbled, his balance failing him. Instinct, stupid and suicidal, took over. Ilara lunged forward, not to attack, not to flee, but to catch him. Her small, frail body collided with his large, frozen one. Her hands came up to brace his chest, the moment her skin touched the fabric of his tunic. Two things happened at once. A searing cold, so intense it was like a fire, shot up her arms, stealing her breath and threatening to stop her heart. But beneath it, from the point of contact, a tiny pulse of warmth bloomed. It was faint, a single candle in a blizzard, but it was there. His glowing eyes widened. The frost on his tunic directly beneath her palms melted. The fabric grew dark with moisture. He stared down at her hands, then up at her face, his expression one of stunned disbelief. The immense pressure in the room lessened, just for a second. He reached out, his own hand impossibly cold, and his fingers brushed against her cheek. The touch was like being branded with ice, but it was not violent. It was hesitant, wondering. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. He saw the frayed collar of her dress, the smudge of soot on her nose, the raw, chapped skin of her hands. But he also saw the fear in her wide brown eyes, and beneath it, something else. A flicker of defiance, a stubborn, resilient spark. You, he breathed, the word a plume of white vapor in the frozen air. It wasn't an accusation, it was a recognition, a discovery that changed the world. He did not kill her. He did not even dismiss her. King Kalen led her from the frozen study, his gait still unsteady, his hand a cold, firm pressure on her arm. He took her to a suite of rooms in the east wing, rooms with thick carpets and a fire that actually gave off heat. They were chambers fit for a noble lady, not a scullery maid. "You will stay here," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You will not leave these rooms without my permission." Ilara stood in the center of the plush rug, bewildered and terrified. "Your Majesty, I don't understand." He turned to face her, his pale eyes searching her face. The aura of cold around him was still immense, but it felt Tamir, less aggressive than it had been in his study. "When you touched me," he said, his voice low, the cold receded. For a moment. He held up his hand, flexing his long fingers. "I have not been able to do that for 50 years. He looked at her not as a person, but as a phenomenon, a puzzle he needed to solve. "This is not a kindness," he stated, his tone flat and devoid of emotion, as if to convince himself as much as her. "It is a necessity. My curse worsens with each passing year. Your presence seems to counter it. You are a tool, nothing more. Do you understand? A tool." The word should have hurt. It was just a fancier version of worthless, but his eyes betrayed him. There was a desperate, flickering hope in their icy depths that contradicted the harshness of his words. She was a tool he desperately needed. For the first time in her life, she was needed. "I understand," she whispered, lowering her gaze. The arrangement began. It was strange and silent. He would summon her to his study. The room was still cold, but no longer coated in ice, and she would simply sit in a chair by the fire while he worked at his desk. He never spoke to her, but she could feel him, feel his constant, agonizing battle against the winter in his veins. And she could feel that somehow, her being there helped. The air was a few degrees warmer. The frost no longer crawled across the papers as he tried to write. Days turned into a week. Servants brought her food on silver trays, food she had only ever dreamed of. They left fine dresses of wool and velvet for her, which she was too afraid to wear, preferring her simple servant's garb. She was a prisoner in a gilded cage, but for the first time she was warm and her belly was full. Intimacy crept in through the cracks of their silence. One evening, he was struggling to unclasp a heavy silver chain around his neck. His fingers, stiff with cold, refused to cooperate. A low growl of frustration rumbled in his chest. Before she could think, Ilara was on her feet. "May I?" she asked softly. He froze, his gaze lifting to meet hers. He hesitated for a long moment, then gave a stiff, jerky nod. She stepped behind his chair, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her fingers, small and nimble, brushed against the cold skin of his neck. A shudder went through him at her touch. The clasp was frozen shut. She cupped her hands around it, her own natural body heat a stark contrast to his chilling temperature. She held them there, focusing, imagining a tiny spark of warmth flowing from her into the metal. After a moment, the clasp gave with a soft click. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice thick. She returned to her seat, her hands tingling. She had not imagined it. A definite warmth had flowed from her, a tiny, controllable spark. What was she? He began to see her too. He noticed the network of faint, silvery scars on the backs of her hands. "Where did you get these?" he asked one night, his voice startling her out of a doze. She looked down at her hands. "My first master, before I was brought to the citadel. He was not a kind man." She did not elaborate. She did not need to. The simple, honest statement hung in the air between them, a testament to a life of pain she had quietly endured. He said nothing, but the next morning a small pot of healing salve, fragrant with herbs, sat on the table beside her breakfast tray. The unspoken gesture was more intimate than any conversation. He claimed she was a tool, but he was tending to her, maintaining her. Another night, a tremor racked his body, more violent than usual. He gasped, dropping his quill, and pressed a hand to his chest. His breathing grew shallow. Alara rushed to his side, her fear for him overriding her fear of him. "What is it?" "It is inside," he gritted out, his eyes screwed shut. "The ice is forming. In my lungs." She didn't know what to do. Panicked, she placed her hands on his back, over his lungs, and pushed. Not with strength, but with that same strange inner warmth she had used on the clasp. She poured her will into it, her desperate plea for him to be all right. A wave of heat, stronger this time, pulsed from her palms. It felt like she had plunged her hands into a forge. Kalen arched his back, a sharp hiss escaping his lips. It was not a sound of pain, but of relief. The tremor subsided. His breathing evened out. He slumped in his chair, exhausted. He turned his head slowly, his icy eyes locking with hers. The raw vulnerability in his gaze shattered the last of her fear. He was not a monster. He was a man in a cage of eternal winter, and she, somehow, held the key. "Stay," he whispered, his voice ragged. It was not a command. It was a plea. She did not return to her chair. She knelt on the floor beside him, and for the rest of the night, she kept one hand on his arm, a small point of warmth against the encroaching frost. The boundary was broken. They both knew it. This was no longer an arrangement of necessity. It was something else entirely, something terrifying and hopeful. The whispers started as a trickle and became a flood. The servant girl, the Omega, was no longer a servant. She lived in the East Wing. She wore fine clothes. She spent her days and nights locked away with the reclusive Alpha King. Luna Valeriana watched it all, her calm facade hiding a raging blizzard of fury. For years, she had been the one in charge. She managed the court, the alliances, the day-to-day running of a kingdom whose king was slowly freezing to death. She had positioned herself perfectly. When he finally succumbed, the transition of power to her would be seamless. She would be queen. This worthless, soot-stained girl was ruining everything. Worse, the king was changing. He began to appear outside the West Wing. He walked the castle corridors, Alara a quiet shadow at his side. The frost that had always clung to him was less pronounced. There was a hint of color in his cheeks. The oppressive cold that had choked the citadel for decades seemed to be lifting, replaced by a cool, crisp air. Hope, a dangerous and unfamiliar emotion, began to stir among the pack. Valeriana knew she had to act. She began the campaign herself, a drop of poison in the ear of a courtier here, a concerned whisper to a council elder there. "She is a witch," she would say, her voice laced with false worry. "Using some dark magic to ensnare him, to drain his power for her own. Have you seen her eyes? There is an unnatural light in them. She has him under a spell." The court, accustomed to Valeriana's authority, listened. The pack, fearful of the unknown, believed. The gazes that fell on Alara were no longer dismissive. They were filled with suspicion and hatred. She felt their animosity like a physical blow, a return to the worthlessness she had almost forgotten. She would walk beside Kaelin, her head held high as he taught her to, but inside, she was shrinking. Kaelin was oblivious to the whispers, or perhaps he simply did not care. His focus was entirely on Alara. He saw the strength she tried to hide, the kindness she offered to the lowest of the pack, the fierce intelligence in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. He started bringing her to council meetings, seating her in a chair beside his throne. He didn't ask for her opinion, but he would glance at her, a silent question in his eyes, after a particularly difficult debate. Her presence seemed to ground him, to keep the cold at bay so his mind could remain clear. This was the final insult for Valeriana. To see that gutter rat in a place of honor, her place, was more than she could bear. She decided to force the issue, to expose the girl for the nothing she was in front of the entire council. The council chamber was full. Elders, pack alphas, and nobles lined the long table. Kaelin sat on his throne of carved ironwood, looking more regal and powerful than he had in a century. Alara sat beside him, small and terrified in her simple wool dress, feeling the weight of 100 hostile stares. Valeriana stood, her bearing imperious. "Alpha King," she began, her voice ringing with authority. "We are here to discuss the renewed trade treaty with the Sunstone Pack, a matter of great importance." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room before landing with deliberate contempt on Alara. "I must question the wisdom of having distractions present during such sensitive negotiations." Kaelin's eyes narrowed. "She is not a distraction." "Isn't she?" Valeriana pressed, emboldened by the murmurs of agreement from her allies on the council. "She is a servant, an omega of no lineage, no power, no standing. What could she possibly offer? We have all seen your recovery since she appeared. We have all heard the whispers of witchcraft. This girl has clouded your judgment, Your Majesty. You bring her here, to our most sacred council, and for what? She has no place here." Her voice rose, filled with righteous fury. She pointed a finger at Alara, who flinched as if struck. "Look at her, hiding behind your throne like a frightened mouse. She's worthless. A servant girl who should be scrubbing floors, not sitting in the presence of alphas." The words hit Alara like stones. Worthless. The brand on her soul seared anew. The shame was so intense, she thought she might be sick. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her. She felt Kaelin tense beside her, a low growl beginning in his chest, the temperature in the room dropping dangerously. But before he could unleash his fury, he stopped. He looked at Alara, at her bowed head and trembling shoulders. He saw not a witch, but a girl who had been beaten down by the world her entire life, a girl who had saved him nonetheless. He saw the woman he was falling in love with. Rage, cold and absolute, settled over him. But it was not for Alara. Slowly, deliberately, he stood. The entire room fell silent. He was a towering, intimidating presence, the full power of the Alpha King radiating from him. But his movements were calm, measured. He reached up and, with both hands, removed the crown from his head. It was a simple, brutalist circlet of jagged silver and ice, a symbol of his cursed reign. He held it for a moment, the weight of centuries in his hands. Then he walked the few steps to where Alara sat, frozen in her chair. He knelt before her. The council gasped as one. Their king, the monster of Icefang, was kneeling to a servant. He looked up at her, his pale eyes filled with a fierce protective light she had never seen before. And with a gentleness that defied his reputation, he placed the heavy silver crown upon her head. It was cold against her skin, but the cold was no longer painful. It settled over her, a strange and terrible weight. He remained kneeling, his gaze never leaving hers. Then he turned his head and looked at Valeriana, his voice low and lethal, echoing in the stunned silence. "Then you will address your queen." The aftermath of Kaelin's declaration was a stunned, simmering silence. Valeriana's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred, her skin pale, her lips a bloodless line. She had been publicly humiliated, her authority shattered by a single, impossible gesture. She gave Alara a look that promised death, then turned and swept from the room, her allies avoiding her gaze. The crown was heavy on Alara's head. She felt like a child playing dress-up in her mother's clothes. A queen? Her? The idea was so absurd, so far beyond the realm of possibility, that she felt a hysterical laugh bubble in her chest. But Kaelin's eyes held her, steady and serious. He believed it, and that terrified her more than anything. Valeriana did not wait. Humiliation had festered into a desperate, murderous rage. She had lost the political game. Now she would resort to the magic she had long studied in secret. The magic of the original curse. In the deepest crypts of the citadel, she found what she was looking for. A shard of obsidian, veined with pulsing blue light. It was a fragment of the frozen heart of the winter spirit that Kaelin's ancestor had slain, the act which had brought the curse upon their bloodline. The legend said that to touch the shard to the heart of a cursed one was to invite the spirit's full wrath, freezing them from the inside out, turning them to a statue of eternal ice. It was a power she could now use to reclaim her destiny. That night, as Alara slept fitfully in her grand bed, the crown on a velvet pillow beside her, the attack came. There was no warning. A wave of unimaginable cold swept through the castle, extinguishing fires, cracking stone, and freezing water in its pitchers. Alara was thrown from her bed by the force of it. She gasped, her breath turning to instant frost. The bond she shared with Kaelin, that fragile, unacknowledged connection, screamed in her mind. It was a feeling of pure agony, of a soul being ripped apart by ice. She ran. She flew down the corridors, her bare feet numb on the flash-frozen floors. She burst into his chambers. Kaelin was on the floor, convulsing. Thick, blue-white ice was crawling up his limbs, starting from his chest. His skin was the color of a glacier, his lips blue. He was gasping, each breath a struggle against the ice solidifying in his lungs. Valeriana stood over him, her hand pressed to his heart, the obsidian shard glowing with a malevolent light. "He is mine," she hissed, her eyes wild with triumph. "The throne is mine. The power is mine." Guards loyal to her burst into the room, their swords drawn. They grabbed Alara, their hands rough, their faces grim. "The witch is an assassin," one of them yelled. "She has killed the king." They dragged her away, her screams echoing in the frozen hallway. She fought, kicking and scratching, her eyes fixed on Kaelin's dying form. The last thing she saw before they hauled her down to the dungeons was the light in his pale eyes extinguishing, the ice closing over his face. The dungeon was the coldest place she had ever been. It was a pit of despair, dark and damp and utterly silent. They threw her into a cell, the iron door clanging shut with a sound of finality. She was alone with her grief. She could feel him. The bond was a thread, stretched thin and taut, humming with a pain that was not her own. It was growing colder, fainter. A candle flame flickering in a hurricane. He was dying. They had killed him. And she, His one source of warmth, his tool, his queen, was locked away, helpless. Despair washed over her, a wave as cold and crushing as the one that had swept the castle. It was all her fault. Valeriana was right. She was worthless. A servant girl who had dared to dream, and in doing so, had destroyed the man who had lifted her up. She curled into a ball on the filthy straw, a single frozen tear tracing a path down her cheek. The thread of their bond grew weaker, fainter, almost gone. No. The word was not a thought. It was a rebellion that started deep in her soul. It was the memory of a pup sharing her bread. It was the feel of a frozen clasp clicking open in her hands. It was the look in his eyes when he knelt before her. He had seen something in her. He had believed in her. She would not let that belief die in a cold, dark cell. Rage, hot and cleansing, burned away her despair. A new strength flooded her veins. She would not let him go. She would not let that witch win. She rose to her feet, her eyes scanning the dark cell. The lock was heavy iron, ancient and strong. The door was solid oak. Impossible. She placed her hand on the iron lock. It was frigid, leaching the heat from her skin. She closed her eyes, not thinking, just feeling. She remembered the warmth she had summoned before, that tiny, controllable spark. This time, she didn't ask for a spark. She demanded a fire. She poured all her rage, her love, her desperate, defiant will into her hand. A searing heat exploded from her palm. The iron lock glowed red, then white. With a sound like a firecracker, it melted, dripping to the stone floor in molten slag. Alara stared at her hand, which was tingling but unharmed. She had done that. The power, the warmth inside her, was real. It was hers. She pushed the door open and stepped out into the corridor. The two guards Valeriana had posted stared, their jaws slack with disbelief. Before they could react, she moved. She was no fighter, but she was fast. She shoved past them, a wave of heat radiating from her that made them stumble back, their hands coming up to shield their faces from the sudden glare. She ran, her heart a war drum in her chest. The citadel was a frozen labyrinth, but the bond, however faint, was her guide. It pulled her, a cold, desperate beacon, toward the throne room. She burst through the grand doors. The scene was a nightmare tableau. Kalen lay upon a stone dais where the throne once stood, his body almost completely encased in jagged, blue-tinged ice. He looked like a king entombed in a glacier. Valeriana stood before him, her hands raised, chanting in a forgotten tongue, the obsidian shard pulsing in time with her words. Her loyalists formed a circle around the dais, their faces grim, their spears lowered. "It is too late, little cinder," Valeriana sneered, not even turning to look at her. "The ritual is almost complete. The last of his life force will be transferred to me. I will have the strength of a king, and he will be nothing but a monument to my victory." "You will not have him," Alara said, her voice low and steady, ringing with a power she had never known she possessed. She walked forward, ignoring the guards who moved to block her. The air around her shimmered with heat. The spears they pointed at her began to glow at the tips, the metal turning red. The guards cried out, dropping their weapons and backing away from the impossible heat. Alara reached the dais. She looked down at Kalen's face, trapped beneath a translucent layer of ice. His eyes were closed. He was so still. The bond was a bare whisper, a final fading echo. Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of fury. "He is gone," Valeriana taunted. "Your little spark was nothing against a true storm." "My spark is all he needs," Alara whispered. She reached out and placed her hands on his frozen chest. She closed her eyes and poured everything she was into that touch, every memory, every shared silence. the weight of his crown on her head, the feel of his cold hand on her cheek, the desperate hope in his eyes, her grief, her rage, her love. A fierce, defiant, all-consuming love. "I will not let you go," she vowed, the words a sacred oath. The power inside her did not just answer, it erupted. It was not a spark. It was not a fire. It was the sun. A wave of pure golden light and incandescent heat burst from her in a silent, expanding sphere. It was not a destructive force. It was a creative one, a force of life and warmth. The thick ice covering Kaelin did not just melt, it sublimated, turning to glittering vapor in an instant. The unnatural cold in the throne room was banished, replaced by the warmth of a summer morning. The obsidian shard in Valeriana's hand screamed, a high, piercing shriek of a dying thing, and then shattered into 1,000 pieces of black dust. The backlash of power threw her across the room, where she collapsed in a heap, her stolen power gone, leaving her just a woman, gasping and broken. The golden light subsided, coalescing back into Ilara. She stood over Kaelin, her simple dress glowing with embers, her hair alive with dancing flames. She was terrifying and beautiful, a queen of fire and life. Kaelin gasped, a deep, shuddering breath that filled his lungs with warm air for the first time in his life. The blue tint of his skin vanished, replaced by the healthy flush of life. He opened his eyes. They were no longer the pale, colorless eyes of a winter sky. They were a clear, vibrant gray, like a storm cloud after the rain has passed. The curse was gone, not suppressed, not held at bay. It was broken, burned away by her light. He pushed himself up onto his elbows, his gaze fixed on Alara. He looked at the power radiating from her, the flames licking at the hem of her dress, the embers in her hair. He didn't look shocked or afraid. He looked vindicated. He looked as if he was finally seeing in its full glory the truth he had sensed from the very first moment she had stumbled into his frozen life. "I knew," he breathed, his voice hoarse. "I knew you were more." He reached for her, and she fell into his arms. He was warm. For the first time, his touch was truly, deeply warm. She clung to him, burying her face in his chest, her tears finally falling, hot and cleansing. He held her tightly, his strength a solid, grounding presence. The entire court, those who had been loyal and those who had sided with Valeriana, stood frozen, watching in silent, reverent awe. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face. The last of the embers in her hair faded, but the light in her eyes remained. "Ilara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he had been denied for centuries. He spoke the words knowing they had been a death sentence for his entire bloodline, but he no longer cared. He had to say them. "I love you." The words did not kill him. They healed him. They settled into the space where the curse had lived, filling the void with a warmth that had nothing to do with her magic, and everything to do with hers. Ilara looked at him, at this king who had seen a queen in a worthless servant, and the last of her self-doubt broke and washed away. She was not worthless. She was not a tool. She was a fire. She was his, and he was hers. "And I love you," she answered, her voice ringing with the strength of 100 foundries, the certainty of the rising sun. He lowered his head and kissed her, a kiss of warmth and life and promise, as the first rays of a true dawn broke through the windows of the throne room, banishing the last of the shadows. 3 months later, spring came to the Icefang Citadel. It was a miracle that left the oldest members of the pack weeping in the courtyards. For the first time in living memory, green shoots pushed their way through the thawing earth. Small, stubborn mountain flowers bloomed in the crevices of the stone walls. The air was clean and fresh, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth instead of the sterile bite of eternal frost. The kingdom was healing, and so were its rulers. Queen Ilara, no one dared call her otherwise, was no longer a shadow. She stood beside Kaelin not as a consort, but as an equal. Her innate warmth and kindness tempered his stern, kingly resolve. Where he was the unyielding mountain, she was the sun that thawed it, allowing life to flourish. The people who had first feared her as a witch now revered her as a savior. They called her the Sun Queen. Valeriana was a prisoner in the highest tower of the keep she had once schemed to rule. Her treachery had been laid bare for all to see. Stripped of her power and influence, she was left with nothing but her bitter regret. A fate, Kaelin had decreed, far worse than a clean death. The royal study, once a tomb of ice, was now the warmest room in the castle. A fire crackled merrily in the hearth, its heat now welcome and comforting. Sunlight streamed through the clear glass windows, illuminating the swirling dust motes. Ilara was curled in the large armchair that had once been Kaelin's frozen throne, a heavy book of histories open in her lap. She was no longer dressed in servant's garb, or even the fine wool gown she had first been given. She wore a simple but elegant gown of deep green, the color of new leaves, with delicate gold embroidery at the cuffs. The crown of ice and silver was gone, melted down and reforged. In its place she wore a delicate circlet of gold that Kaelin had made for her himself, shaped like intertwined sunbeams. She felt a presence behind her and smiled without looking up. Kaelin moved with a quiet grace now, his steps no longer heavy with the weight of his curse. He came up behind her chair and wrapped his arms around her, resting his chin on the top of her head. His touch was a familiar, comforting warmth against her skin. "Reading about my boring ancestors again?" he murmured, his breath warm against her hair. "I have to," she teased, leaning back against his solid chest. "Someone has to make sure you don't repeat their mistakes." He chuckled, a low, pleasant sound that she loved more than any music. He pressed a soft kiss to her temple. "There is no danger of that. None of them had you." The simple truth of his words settled in her heart, a comforting weight. They were a team, a balance. He had given her a place, a name, a crown. She had given him back his life, his warmth, his world. It was a rescue that had gone both ways. "The emissaries from the Sunstone Pack arrive tomorrow," he said, his tone shifting to that of the king. "They are eager to finalize the treaty. They say the thaw in our lands is a sign of a new age of prosperity." "It is," she said, her voice soft but certain. She closed the book and turned in his arms to face him. She traced the line of his jaw, a jaw that was no longer perpetually clenched against pain. "It's the age of us." He captured her hand, bringing her palm to his lips and kissing the center of it, right over the faint silvery scars that were all that remained of her old life. "The age of us," he agreed, his clear gray eyes full of a love so profound it still sometimes stole her breath away. He was no longer the feared Ice King, and she was no longer the worthless servant girl. He was Kaelin. She was Ilara. Together they had faced down a curse, a usurper, and a lifetime of pain. They had walked through the winter and emerged into the spring. He led her to the window, and they stood looking out over their thawing kingdom. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold that were reflected in the newly melted streams that now ran down the mountainside. It was a land of promise, a future waiting to be built. She had a home. She had a purpose. She belonged. She leaned her head on his shoulder, his arm a secure and steady presence around her, and watched the beginning of their new world.